One of the biggest lies ever told is that race is a biological reality. In truth, race was created as a social and legal construct to justify power, exploitation, and division. Colonial powers and ruling elites invented racial categories not for scientific or cultural reasons, but as a hierarchy of dominance that allowed them to control entire populations.
In the 16th through 18th century, Spanish America's indigenous and African people outnumbered the Spaniards. So colonizers needed a way to manage its multi-ethnic colonies and prevent rebellion. So they had to make sure that the different groups did not unite. So they created a racial ranking system based on ancestry. By giving some privileges to mixed individuals, they created loyalty to the Spanish crown while maintaining white supremacy. Spaniards categorized people into dozens of racial castes to maintain white Spanish dominance. The more Spanish blood you had, the better privileges you had.
The categories included came to be known as the Spanish Casta System, where people were categorized as Peninsulares, which were the pure Spaniards born in Spain, and they had the most power. Criollos, who were Spaniards born in the Americas, were second in power. Mestizos, who had mixed Spanish and indigenous blood, had limited rights. Mulattoes, who were mixed Spanish and African heritage, had even fewer rights. And lastly, there were Indios and Negros, that is, indigenous and African people who were the lowest class, enslaved, and forced laborers.
The effects of the Casta system still exist today. Latin America still struggles with colorism, where whiter individuals have higher status. Light-skinned Latinos dominate politics, media, and wealth, and many Latinos outright deny their indigenous or African roots due to colonial era brainwashing.
Colorism within the Latinx community can be so complex because it covers the entire skin color spectrum.
People that are lighter skinned are preferred and have more privilege than people that are darker skinned.
I don't remember ever feeling like I wasn't beautiful, but what I do remember is feeling that people with light skin were more beautiful than me.
State Senator Karina Villa is a Mexican-American who was born in suburban West Chicago. Being darker-skinned is a challenge she says she's faced in her career and even within her family. The impact of skin tone goes far beyond standards of beauty and stereotypes.
When we look at Latin America, the people that are Afro-Latinos or that are indigenous Latinos are at the bottom in every indicator.
In the United States, the racial classification system developed during the 17th through 20th centuries were based primarily on the infamous one-drop rule, which asserted that if you had even one drop of black blood or African ancestry, regardless of how you look, you were considered black.
This meant mixed race individuals, no matter how light-skinned they were denied white privilege. Initially, the rule was about property inheritance. White slave owners fathered children with enslaved black women, and instead of allowing those children to inherit their father's status, the one-drop rule ensured they remained enslaved. This protected the wealth of the white families and reinforced the economic system of slavery.
Eventually, these laws came to have long-lasting social ramifications in that they solidified white purity and supremacy, ensuring whiteness remained exclusive by enforcing segregation. In fact, it wasn't until the year 2000 that the U.S. Census began allowing multiracial identification. Before that, biracial people were forced to pick one race. Even today, people still see individuals mixed with black as black. And this is a reflection of how deeply ingrained this concept is.
I think it is impossible to be biracial in America. And I think that it requires that you're covering all bases at all times. And it requires constant recognition of both identities.
Many white individuals still fear race mixing as a threat to white dominance.
There's a third example of a racial construct. Let's take a moment to look at the South African apartheid system.
Apartheid was a system of legalized segregation enforced from 1948 to 1994. This system was designed to separate races and enforce white minority rule over the black majority in order to keep white South Africans in control of land, wealth, and resources. The government used racial classification to divide and conquer.
The South African apartheid government classified people into 4 racial groups: white, who were of European descent, and they had full rights; colored, who were mixed race, usually between black and white, giving them some measure of rights; Indian, who had limited rights but restricted movements; black or indigenous Africans, who unfortunately had no rights and were forced into rural, underdeveloped townships with little to no infrastructure.
Even within non-white groups, the government created artificial divisions. For example, separating the Zulu and the Hausa people. The white South African government also created additional division and confusion by classifying the indigenous Khoi and San peoples as colored, which led people to believe this group was mixed race, when in fact, they predated colonization. Anthropologists have declared the San people as the oldest race of people on the planet.
We are the descendants of the first people of the world according to science. Not only of South Africa. Every nation on the planet derives from us. The Chinese, the DNA is traced back to us.
They must recognize the colored people. We were here first. The Khoi and San was here first. This is our country. The country belongs to the colored.
Africa's first nation suffered the earliest forms of colonization before the Zulu kingdom, before the Soto, before the Dutch even dreamed of setting sail. The Khoi and San lived and thrived in South Africa. Today, many Coloureds argue that their classification was a tool of white supremacy to separate them from the black majority. The term colored was not a natural identity. It was a category created by colonists and later enforced by the apartheid regime.
The colored racial classification is not a race. It's not a race. It was a classification. There's no DNA for the colored person. There's no DNA.
I hear you.
It was a group of white supremacists who sat around the table and said, how do we ensure that we keep South Africans divided?
If coloreds were considered black, the white minority would have been overwhelmed. Instead, they were placed in a category of their own to keep them separate from black South Africans, given just enough privileges to prevent unity, but never enough to be equal to whites. Think about it. In America and other countries that enslaved Africans, mixed race people were classified as black to maintain the white power structure. In turn, in South Africa, they were classified as colored to maintain white dominance. Two different strategies, but the same goal: divide and control. Laws also restricted who could marry, where people could live, and what jobs they could hold based on race. Apartheid officially ended, but South Africa is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. White South Africans still own most of the land and economic resources, and black South Africans were never fully compensated for centuries of economic and cultural oppression.
Now, let's take a moment to think about this. Apartheid only recently ended in 1993.
To put that in perspective, in 1993, Bill Clinton was sworn in as president. Prince Charles and Princess Diana announced their divorce.
The movie Groundhog Day, starring Bill Murray, was one of the most popular movies released. And on October 31st, River Phoenix died at age 27 on the sidewalk outside the popular West Hollywood nightclub, the Viper Room. And on a lighter note, in November 1993, Snoop Dogg released his debut album, Doggy Style.
And I graduated high school in 93. The point is that 1993 was supposed to be a pretty progressive time, but South Africans were still living in a sort of modern-day Jim Crow nightmare.
Now, classifying people into these very non-scientific categories or race was not quite enough to solidify the power structure. The patriarchy took it a step farther and instituted strict laws to uphold white dominance.
For example, the Jim Crow laws in the U.S. Jim Crow was a pejorative term that evolved from the minstrel shows, but eventually came to represent the system of state and local laws enacted in the southern United States that enforced racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. These laws primarily limited their access to public facilities, voting, and civil rights. Additionally, the United States created anti-miscegenation laws to prevent racial mixing and keep bloodlines pure.
There's also Australia's stolen generations, where between 1910 and the 1970s, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were forcefully removed from their homes. The removal was sanctioned by various government policies, which were based on ideas around assimilation that claimed the lives of the First Nation people would be improved if they became a part of white society.
These policies proposed that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait people should be allowed to die out through natural elimination, or where possible, assimilate into white communities. These policies targeted children because they figured they would be more adaptable, thereby easier to assimilate. The result was a lasting legacy of trauma and an immeasurable loss of cultural and social identity.
The ideologies behind these racial laws have carried over into modern times. For example, current immigration policies rely on restrictive quotas and nationality-based preferences, meaning that immigrants from European and Asian countries are often prioritized over immigrants from other countries.
Though the United States has a long history of using voter suppression to discourage African Americans from voting, there has been a resurgence of these tactics over the last few years. Everything from changing ID laws to dropping legally registered voters to closing the polls early have been used in recent elections to dissuade certain populations from voting.
Voter suppression exists when you have leaders who try to prevent you or discourage you from voting. When they use undermining the fundamental premise of voting to block your participation, that is suppression.
In the last 2 years, 17 million people were removed from the voting rolls in the United States, many of them eligible voters.
And Republicans clearly in Texas and throughout the country want to make it harder to vote and easier to steal an election. That's the only way that I can interpret the voter suppression epidemic that we see working its way from one state, Georgia, to Arizona, to Texas, and all across the country in so many different ways.
As we already mentioned, the patriarchy asserted their dominance through the creation of a false system of race, then putting that system into law. But perhaps the most insidious way white dominance has maintained control was indoctrination.
Colonizers forced their language, culture, and Christian religion on indigenous and black people. There were forced conversions in Latin America and Africa. When Africans arrived on the shores of the Americas, they faced severe punishment if they used their native tongue or engaged in any cultural practices. Within one generation, most enslaved people had lost their cultural identity.
Native American children were forcibly removed from their homes and tribes and put into residential schools in an attempt to assimilate them into white culture.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization. John Brown,
John Brown, John Brown. And of course, there are the white savior narratives in movies, literature, and global charity work, where a white character is portrayed as the rescuer or liberator of people of color, often portraying them as needing white intervention. When you look across history from the Spanish Casta System to the one-drop rule to South African apartheid, to Jim Crow, to Australia's stolen generation. I could go on for days. You see the same blueprint repeated over and over. Race was never about biology. It was never about culture. It was about control. Race was a global strategy to divide and rule over people. A way to make whiteness the top floor of a house built on other people's backs. Then they pretend the architecture was natural. We must remember that if race was constructed, it can be deconstructed. If hierarchies were invented, they can be dismantled. And that's exactly what the world is trying to do right now. The old system knows its time has run out, and it's fighting to the last breath to keep power in its hands, as supposedly it was designed. But understanding the roots of these systems gives us the power to uproot them and to challenge the hierarchies we were never meant to accept in the first place. The future doesn't belong to the people who cling to the past. It belongs to the people who dare to imagine something better. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. Can't go back. Thank you for watching. Until next time.